Hello there, my name is Neil Buttery, food historian and chef, and welcome to the British Food History Podcast. My guest today is baker, writer and teacher David Wright, author of the excellent book Breaking Bread, How Baking Shaped Our World, published by Aurum. I'll let you know my news at the end of the episode, except for this one special headline. The website is live and the tickets are now available to purchase for the Serve It Forth Food History Festival. It's online, it's for one day, and it's on the 18th of October. Sam Bilton, Alessandra Pino, Thomas Ntinas, and me have been working hard behind the scenes, and we're curating a session each. Visit the website, which is in the show notes, for more details of the event. There's going to be guests, but they are yet to be announced. But, just between you and me, I have bagged a biggie and I'm very excited about it. Here's what the website says about my bit. Neil Buttery is kicking off the day in conversation with a very special guest about their love of traditional and classic British cooking and how we can keep it alive and relevant today. We'll also be taking a peek at the food cooked and enjoyed by British monarchs from Queen Victoria to Charles III. Eagle-eared listeners will perhaps spot that there's a bit of a clue in that description as to who the guest is. We'll be making further announcements online as to who our guests are in the coming weeks, so make sure you're following on socials. The social media handle and the Eventbrite page are in the show notes along with the website. Thomas Ntinas is going to be presenting A Life of Luxury, the famous chefs of the ancient Greek world. Alessandra Pino has called her session The River Remembers, a journey through London's lost larder. And Sam Bilton, her title is Gourmand or Glutton, Feeding Falstaff. There's going to be plenty of other things apart from guests being announced over the next few weeks, so I'll keep you abreast of everything, of course. As I said, tickets are available on Eventbrite. They're £16, but at the minute, there is an early bird special with 25% off the ticket price, so be quick. As I've said, links in the show notes. Don't forget, Season 9 of the podcast is sponsored by Fruit Pig, Britain's last remaining commercial craft producer of fresh blood black puddings. Fruit Pig, also known as Matthew Cockin and Grant Harper, put a huge amount of care and attention into harvesting fresh blood to create a proper, traditional and very delicious black pudding. Also available is their gluten-free black puddings, their hog's pudding and traditional haggis. Check out your local butcher, they may just stock them. Mine certainly does. Visit fruitpig.co.uk for more details of their products and journey. Find your local stockists and access their shop. Grant and Matthew are very kindly giving listeners to the British Food History Podcast a unique special offer. 10% off your order until the end of October 2025. Use the offer code FOODHIS in the checkout. FOODHIS is all one word, FOODHIS, capital F. If you can, support them, buy their products, because by supporting them, you're supporting the podcast as well. You're killing two birds with one stone. Okay, let's get started. I'm talking with David Wright, author of the book Breaking Bread, How Baking Shaped Our World. It's a fantastic read. It's a high recommend. So I was very pleased when David agreed to come on the podcast to talk about it. He's a third-generation baker, and his book is a heady mix of history and memoir. We talk about the social benefits of bread making, milling grain into flour, roller mills, the Chorleywood process, and why gluten can be compared to Arnold Schwarzenegger and DeVito. Those listening to the Secret Podcast, you get a little over 15 minutes of bonus material that includes additives that are not named on the ingredients list, flatbreads, the dreaded National Loaf, the value of bread, and more. So please enjoy Bread and Bakers with David Wright. Hello, David. Welcome to the British Food History Podcast. It's very exciting to get the chance to speak to you at last.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks for having me on, Neil. This is a real treat. It's my first ever podcast. So
is it?
Honoured to make it my first one.
Okay, well, it's not going to be a Jeremy Paxman style grilling or anything like that. I hope it won't be a walkout for my tricky questions. I very much enjoyed reading your book, Breaking Bread, How Bread Shaped Our World. It's quite the mix. I'm sure it was difficult when it came to writing, but it seems quite effortless. It's a mix of history, proper old school, old-fashioned history, but social history. There's a fair amount of journalism in there. Could you tell us a little bit about, well, first of all, a little bit about yourself and how this book came about?
Well, first of all, I'm a third generation baker from Suffolk. My grandfather and grandmother came from Northumberland, so they were near Holt Whistle, right up north. My grandma on my mum's side, she was from Yorkshire, and my granddad on my mum's side was from Essex, so we've got quite a sort of mix of areas of the UK, but they all came and settled in Suffolk, the sunniest, warmest county in England. So we had a bakery there, a family bakery. And ever since I was a child, baking has been something which has cast a shadow over my life. Everybody has always asked me when I was going to take over the family business. And for a long time, I completely rejected it and was desperate not to be a baker. So I studied quite hard at school. I ended up going to university, went to King's College in London, studied English with film, which is another great passion of mine. And you'll notice as well that the book's got quite a few literary and also film references throughout it, which kind of belies that passion. But eventually baking kind of drew me back in, and I started baking in bakeries in London as a way of earning money pretty much. After 2008, the financial crisis, there were a raft of new bakers sprung up and they all needed help. And, for some reason, I just had the skills that were required by them and they weren't willing to pay me for it. So I kind of fell back into baking, but I've always had a passion for writing. I've always had a passion for storytelling. I've worked a lot in theatre as well. So with theatre companies like Punch Drunk, I've done things with the National Theatre, with the Globe, Battersea Arts Centre, those kind of places. Yeah, I'm a kind of mix. I tend to describe myself as a dime store Forrest Gump, in the sense that he was more successful in the myriad of things that he took on, whereas I'm probably a few levels below. But I still take that approach of trying not to say no to anything and trying to get involved in things where I can.
It's not a surprise you saying that you're interested in writing and film and things like that, because it's very much written in prose, which makes it very readable. And some of the descriptions just feel so crystal clear in my mind when you describe them, especially when you're talking about being very young, being at the bakery, just playing with dough, just being used to being in the surroundings of baking and bakers and bakeries.
Yeah, I think for me, that comes out of a necessity, because a really big part of this book comes from the fact that our own family bakery, which was going for 75 years, closed. And that was quite a big, painful moment for the whole family. And in many ways, this book is my opportunity to fix all of the work of those three generations and to record it, because the business no longer exists, so people can't enjoy that on a day-to-day basis. So it was really important for me to really nail down those descriptions and really give people a sense of those environments, because quite a lot of those environments also are dying out. It's not all rose-tinted descriptions. Some of it's quite grubby. And there's the description of the bakery on my first ever night shift, age 13, and talking about the crust-coloured condensation on the ceiling and these kind of slightly grubby but very real places.
Yes, indeed. Well, you described the environment of working at your dad's bakery to be not possibly conducive, let's say, to the modern day workplace. Very masculine, certain amount of conversational sexism, racism, a lot of machismo and things like that. It did seem quite a scary place for a young person to be in. From the point, I'm projecting, because I'm the least macho person I know, so I would have difficulties in these kind of situations.
Well, I definitely struggled with it because I'm definitely not some kind of alpha character. So it was very difficult for me too. And one of the things which I was keen to do, I've worked with lots of amazing female bakers in the years that I've worked, and I've seen some of the struggles that they've had. I recently read Sally Abbey's book, A Woman's Places in the Kitchen, which is incredible. I think there's been a fair amount of kind of gaslighting to do with people saying, oh, it's not, those environments aren't actually like that. So it was important for me to be honest about what they are like and to just, give confidence to people who, if they have felt uncomfortable, they were right to.
Yes. And it'd be ridiculous to try and paint a picture where everything's positive. Anyway,
it's no fun. It's no fun to make things sugar coated. My favorite characters in books and plays and films are always the ones that are conflicted and confusing. And for me, bread was this thing and baking is this thing for me. It has a massive draw and I'm deeply passionate and I'm so connected to it. But at the same time, I'm repulsed by it and I'm ashamed of it. And there's lots of confusion. And I think writing the book was really important for me because for the first time, I think in my life, it allowed me to come to terms with all of those contradictions and to be okay with them. Like I didn't need to decide. I didn't need to finally say, is bread good or bad? That was a background question for me. But in the end, I it doesn't need to be. I think I like that it's a bit messy. And I think it needs to be a bit messier, if anything.
Yeah. And it's such a staple to life around most of the world, especially when it comes to wheat bread. And one thing I've certainly discovered from doing my research over the last couple of decades is the more staple the ingredients, so things like bread, and I suppose you could say beer and ale, but less so today, things like sugar, all those sort of cheap commodities, tea, coffee, chocolate, always have the most complex stories and deepest waters running beneath them, really. And often those negative things, because they're so important, you either ignore them or brush them aside, pretend they're not happening. But I like the fact that your approach was very, very measured and fair.
I think that, like you say, those staple foods, for me, I imagine them as being blank pieces of paper on which we write or draw our own identities. They are so powerful because of the fact that they're accessible for everyone to make their mark on. And I think that's something that's really, really special about bread in particular, is that it isn't owned by anybody. It's so universal that you never hear about anybody culturally appropriating bread because it belongs to all of us in that sense. And it's those kinds of foods which I think deserve the most protection and the most attention. And at the moment, and in the book, I kind of argue that isn't the case.
Well, you've kind of approached my first question for me a little bit there, because so much of it is produced around the world. It is so important to pretty much every single culture, especially in the Western world. We talk about wheat and breads. It appears in our social structures. It appears in daily language. What do you think? This is a big question. It's one of those questions that sound easy, but they're not really. Just what's so great about bread, do you think? Why do you think everybody essentially changed what they were doing and made everything, the focus of daily life, essentially surround making bread?
Speaking about films, my favourite films are usually like American sports movies. It's my guilty pleasure. And the thing that I love about them is the teamwork. I love the idea of people coming together and sometimes individuals coming together who maybe aren't amazing on their own and in the right environment really blossoming. And it's what I love about bakeries and kitchens, is that you get these lovely team efforts that can produce amazing food. And quite often the individuals that are producing them aren't on their own capable of doing it. It's all to do with how a group of people can produce something wonderful. And for me, that's what bread is. It's very hard to grow your own wheat, mill it, bake it, and end up with an amazing loaf. I don't know if you've ever tried to do it. I've never tried to do it because I just know it would be impossible for me, because I wouldn't be able to grow the wheat in any kind of, efficient, brilliant way that a great farmer could. And I think it's that necessary combination of human skills, ingenuity, intelligence, all of those cultures that come together to produce something which sustains and enriches life. Bread is a fantastic vehicle for life. It can continue and nourish humans, and it can give you the space to have exciting creative ideas. It can give you the freedom from hunger to spend time on art and music and science and all sorts of other things. But aside from that, it also brings other foods together. So bread is a great matchmaker for different flavors, different combinations of foods. A plate with bread on it is, for me, a symbol of unity, of teamwork, of combination. And I don't know, there's something inside me that just gets pleasure out of that feeling.
In fact, one of the things I wanted to ask you about is making flour, because that's a very important thing that's changed so much over the last few centuries. How was it originally done? If we're going back to, early medieval or even earlier, how are people turning dried out wheat into flour?
We start off with something that is probably similar to emmer in ancient Egypt, which would then be crossbred with wild goat grass to produce what we would call bread wheats, which are plump little seeds, which essentially have, and I'm being simplistic here, but 3 constituent parts. So the outside is the bran, which protects the seed. It also contains an amazing amount of dietary fiber, some incredible minerals, vitamins, fats, and it's also the surface on which the bread-making microbes are introduced. So we have yeasts and we have bacteria on the husk that are used in bread making or beer making or any kind of fermentation, in the same way that you do with grapes, and you get those kind of yeasts on the surface of grapes or fruits. Then the other 2 parts are the sort of real headliners, if you like. So we've got the endosperm, which is that big starchy package which we're talking about. And it also contains the 2 gluten-forming proteins, glutenin and gliadin. In the courses that I teach at Pump Street Workshop, I sort of tongue-in-cheekly, if that's a word, I don't think it is.
It is now.
Describe glutenin and gliadin like Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger from the film Twins.
Good.
So Danny DeVito is glutenin and Arnold Schwarzenegger is gliadin. And gliadin is the sort of the one that's got, the big muscles. And you don't find that in other cereal grains. So rye, for instance, has glutenin and glutenin instead of gliadin. And that's the reason why rye breads are always much more dense, because they don't have Arnie providing the strength to give you lovely, fluffy focaccia. That's our endosperm. And then we've got the germ, which is the seed within a seed. It's the part that, if it was planted, would become the new wheat plant. So all of those things together are amazing in combination. And I think that's another thing which I really strongly believe is we need to start eating more flour that has all of those things together. The way that we would make those into a flour is by crushing them. And we see this in very simple early examples with things like kernstones. So saddle kerns that you see showing up from ancient Egypt, Iron Age examples in Europe as well. And it's very basic. It's, we're just taking 2 stones and we're just crushing the grain and it's producing a rough flour. That kind of idea of milling then develops. And as we go into ancient Greece, we get Aurum mills, which are driven by, animal power or human power. And then the people who really kind of kickstart things are the ancient Romans, who give us the technology where we get the mills we're more familiar with today, things like windmills and water mills, where we can start producing more and more flour, more and more wheat. And with each of these developments, I think you see a massive ability in those empires to sustain larger and larger populations. And I think it's definitely, I mean, one of the people I read quite carefully was James C. Scott in his book Against the Grain, where he was trying to discover why it was that wheat was maybe more successful than other cereal grains, and what about it gave it that power. And I think that definitely its ability to be stored as a grain and then to be milled and produced into bread, which could then be, handled and stored.
Oh, that's interesting. So I didn't come across that when I was doing my research. So I always put it down to the fact it's bouncier, which is, of course, a factor, but it's more complicated than that, and there's much more sort of logistical reasons.
There's loads of different ways of looking at it. I mean, when I bake, I always think of the crust as a kind of Tupperware that the loaf is contained within. And when you get a beautifully steamed loaf of sourdough, the crust, you can tell, is kind of shiny and very well sealed. And when you get that, the loaf will always last for much longer than if it's a dustier, drier crust. I sort of would say it's the difference between it being wrapped in plastic or being wrapped in a paper bag. So you can kind of, the skill of the baker will also help with the longevity, but it comes in its own packaging. And I think that's definitely a massive advantage. But essentially the grain itself contains all the potential. And then from the moment it's crushed, it's about turning that potential into actual nutrition, actual value. And with stone grinding, I think the only problem is that the storage then becomes an issue, because as you crush the fats and acids and starches and all those things together, and you make it into a fine particle size, it then attracts moisture, which is what kind of sets the timer for its eventual spoilage. So we now have a clock which is ticking. So we have to then use it. And stone grinding, especially when you're grinding into the wheat, all of those microbes and yeasts and things like that, it's a very lively product. And if anyone's ever baked with really fresh flour, they will notice that their bread takes off like a rocket. It's amazing. I recently did a test where I was initiating a sourdough starter with very stable white flour, which was roller milled, and freshly ground stone milled flour. And the stone milled flour was ready to use as a sourdough starter within 2 days. And the white flour took me 9-10 days before I was able to use it in a recipe.
We should explain to people what the difference is between a flour that's been roller milled or stone ground.
Absolutely. So as I was saying, the milling develops through these different empires: Egyptian, Greek, Roman, and the really big one comes in the Austro-Hungarian Empire in the 1820s, around that time, which is roller milling, which is where you use two big steel rollers that looks like a mangle on steroids, and you're able to put the wheat through these big mangle machines, and for the first time ever you're able to separate out the bran, the endosperm and the germ, and mill those things separately. And it's the baking equivalent to splitting the atom, and it's a point from which baking changed forever. The main thing was that we could now mill the endosperm on its own, so we could get that starchy, energy-rich package with those two gluten-forming proteins on its own, without the fats and acids and all those other really beneficial things, all the things that contain the most amount of life. And it gave us a really inert flour, which technically was wonderful for making softer, lighter, fluffier bakery products.
Well, this comes to a head a little bit talking about the history of bread, because I guess the next step in its evolution is the Chorleywood process, which I reckon basically 100% of people listening are regularly eating, even if they've never heard of the word Chorleywood.
It's a huge moment in bread making. So Chorleywood is, we're talking about 1960s. Lots of these industrially processed, mass-produced foods, I think, are born from a fear that we have collectively. So whether that fear is of food shortage or of sanitary conditions or whatever it is. I think initially the fear was there was definitely a fear of fermentation. So, I sort of speak in the book about there being this fear of fermentation and the idea that by fermenting flour in a dough, the microbes and the yeasts are actually stealing the nutrition from us. So they're not actually working on our behalf. They're taking away nutrition. And if you mix a large amount of dough and leave it to ferment over 3-4 hours, the weight of that dough will actually diminish. And that diminishes because the microbes are consuming certain aspects of it. The fact that pre-digestion is actually super beneficial for us wasn't seen at first when we got the ability to understand things on a microscopic level.
And one of the things I've really noticed, looking at 19th century cookery books, baking books particularly, is how much people put a huge amount of effort into making sure their dough does not go sour. It's considered a bad thing, a limiting thing. What you want to be using is, well, I guess at this time, it's things like compressed yeast, which was the new fancy thing to use, the German yeast as they called it, or there's the fresh barm from beer. One thing we didn't talk about, of course, is very much control of social structures, especially with bread and who gets to grind the bread, who gets to bake the bread. What goes on in tandem is beer, and the same rules apply for beer. So people controlling the population with grinding bread, they're also making the beer. So these fancier people are getting barm yeast risen bread, whereas you and I, the peasants, David, I'm sure which is what we would be, are probably having sourdoughs, except that's not written down because we can't read or write. But then you've got this aspirational pull then, and suddenly sourdough is associated with peasantry. Any other flipping country in Europe thinks that's a good thing, but Britain, no. It's ridiculous.
I think this is one of the complicated things about bread, is that it's been around for so long and we've gone through different chapters of its evolution and its character has flipped a number of times. So we're not entirely sure which version we're dealing with at the moment. One of the big things that big change we spoke about in terms of the milling was huge, because prior to roller milling, if you wanted to have white flour, you'd have to stone grind the whole grain, and then you'd have to go through the fairly laborious process of then sieving it or bolting it through finer and finer meshes. And if you got the very, very fine white flour, which I kind of is akin to like the fillet steak of the wheat, it's a very rich, very revered piece of the plant. And that whole thing changed with roller milling, where you were able to industrially, on a big scale, produce white flour. So then you have this situation where white flour used to be precious and only a few people would get some white flour, and then everybody else would have to eat the rest of the wheat. And now we can mill it on its own. We can send the bran off for cattle feed or animal feed. And, the germ can be, again, dealt with separately. It changes those social ideas of what is valuable. And so we now get a sense of white bread becoming more associated with lower socioeconomic groups rather than the higher end.
Yes, all that infrastructure and technology making it cheap. And I suppose it's got a much longer shelf life too, which helps.
Absolutely. And it's perfect for mass-produced food. It's ideal. It's also very consistent for going through large food factories, which again is another key aspect to this globalization of food and standardization of it.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found strange now is that it's something that I didn't question actually growing up, but now food is my profession. When you bake your own loaf of bread, it goes stale. If you leave supermarket bread, it doesn't ever go stale really, but it does go mouldy. Whereas I've never had a loaf of real bread, in inverted commas, ever go mouldy. It's a completely different thing. So when it comes to supermarket loaves then, are we saying that even if you go to the little in-store bakery and buy their sourdough, or what they call sourdough, it's all Chorleywood?
Well, it's not all Chorleywood.
Okay.
So Chorleywood requires a lot of very expensive equipment. The biggest impact that Chorleywood had on the baking industry was that by its very existence, it provided a benchmark for other bakeries to aspire to. And without having the capital to invest in these large, expensive pieces of equipment, there was a move towards more chemical-based bread. So we see the same scientists who are making the Chorleywood bread process possible are then producing a package of additives which smaller bakeries can use with their existing equipment to produce a product which is similar.
I see.
So this is something which, again, I've seen lots growing up, is the use of these additives, even by small family bakers like my own, at various points where family members weren't present, to produce bread which was like the soft, fluffy Chorleywood bread that you could get.
Gosh, it must be so tempting to move into that, go into that direction when you're a small family-run bakery, because life would be easier. You know, it's one of those things, it's a moralistic choice, and you got to decide whether your morals are more important than economics at the end of the day.
I think the really challenging thing about that is that there's this constant voice from people saying, this is what people want. They don't want wholemeal sourdough. You would be foolish to make it. My own father made sourdough in the 1980s and tried to sell it and couldn't find a market for it.
That's very forward-thinking.
It's very forward-thinking, but
your dad?
My dad's very passionate about bread, and he kind of has instilled that in me as well. And the fact that the thing that people want is this soft bread, and there's the pressure, and then ingredient costs go up, and then there's the cost of labour goes up. And it's constantly feeding into this cycle of more and more pressure, especially on small business owners, to kind of go down that road. Most of the small family bakeries that you will remember, or listeners will remember from, you know, the 1990s, 1980s, 1970s, will have been using these additives.
Do you think that, looking back at the home baker, so we've been talking a lot about commercial baking, it used to be considered a good thing and a cheap thing to make bread at home, but we live in a rather different world these days where gas or electric's pretty expensive. Is it a false economy now to make bread at home, do you think?
I think home bakers have got the best opportunity at making the best quality, affordable bread. It's interesting that we talk about the idea of buying bread as being such a normal idea. And it hasn't been throughout history. I mean, you know, it would be normal for people to make their own bread through most of history. The idea of actually spending money and going to a bakery and buying bread is a fairly modern idea. So, you know, whilst we do have examples of larger scale bread production from Egypt or Rome, ancient Rome, you know, throughout history, the idea of making your own bread, I think, is something that's quite normal. The thing I'm really passionate about is getting people to make their own bread at least some of the time, because then you really understand what goes into it and you really start to value it. When you make your own loaf of sourdough at home, the idea of spending what you feel was an exorbitant amount of money before, suddenly you're like, oh, I understand why it costs that much now. And I also understand why it has that value. Because it really does.
Yeah, sourdough's a bit tricky to get your head around at first. I mean, I learnt first of all, just making white bread, cobs of white bread, because I didn't have any tins, which is obviously, I think, the best way to start. Even if you're aiming for baking sourdough, it is tricky. There's not so much gluten. It's very gloopy. So I always say to people, if you haven't baked bread much and you want to get bread on the table, start with good old white bread with some dried yeast. Get that down to a fine art. It won't take you long because it's not that hard. These big bread companies like to make it out that, you know, this is going to take up all of your day. Probably takes out about maybe 15 minutes of your day. I mean, it's split up into different bits, but it's not that hard.
The thing that I say about how hard it is to make bread, if it was really complicated and difficult, you wouldn't exist. The reason you exist now and the reason that so many people exist on Earth is because bread making is easy.
No, indeed. It's one of the things that I discovered when I first started teaching myself how to cook. I'd never made bread, so I didn't know what I was doing. Weirdly, I failed the first few times because I tried to read methods, and it's very hard to write a method for getting the feel for something. It requires so much creative writing, it's basically impossible. Put a YouTube video on, watch somebody knead some bread for 2 minutes, and you go, oh, okay. Oh, it's easy, fine. But it's very hard to put it into words. I would say to people, if they are wanting to bake more bread, have a look at a couple of YouTube videos. You'll see that it's absolute cinch.
I definitely agree with that. And I think that's where we get the idea of passing information down. Like you pass something by hand from one set of hands to another set of hands. And it's that connection through hands, which has been broken over the last 80, 100 years. And we need to then get that back. And I think if you do have the knowledge, I think you also have the responsibility to pass it on, which is now kind of what my life has become about, is about trying to pass that knowledge on to other people. Within the supermarket environment, you can call any loaf of bread sourdough. It has no legal definition. And there's lots of baking terms which don't have any legal definition, which are used to indicate quality to the consumer. Things like handmade, artisan, sourdough, all these things give us a picture in our head of the quality and the nutritional availability of the product we're going to buy, whereas they don't actually have to be held to any kind of standard. And I think this is one of the areas which I'm most keen to see some change and some pressure, because I think if you're reading an article in a newspaper which tells you that sourdough is better for you health-wise, I think when you go to the shop and you see something advertised as sourdough, I think that should be held to a certain set of standards. And I'm not even talking about many standards. I could walk into a supermarket today and purchase a loaf of sourdough which contains yeast and a whole host of additives, which it would be in any kind of mass-produced loaf. The difference is I'm going to pay a lot more for it. And that money is going to people who don't understand the sourdough process, and they are cheating the artisans who have built up the brand value in sourdough, in properly produced bread, and they're exploiting the consumers because the consumer assumes that product will be held to some kind of standard. And I think people need to know that's just not happening at the moment. And we need to put more pressure on the government to take action and to make those changes so that the food we can eat can be just labelled honestly. And then we can make our decision.
There's so much packed into the book, and we've barely scratched the surface, really. It really zips along. What's great is the number of people that you've spoken to, the sort of journalistic angle which we haven't really talked about in the book, it's really good to see or hear about other people's opinions, what they think. And what I really liked was that you asked every interviewee when they're picturing some bread, what pops into their head, which I thought was quite interesting. Quite a variety of answers.
Definitely. Well, let me ask you, Neil, when I say, and for you listening as well, if I say the word bread and you close your eyes, what picture do you have in your head?
The picture that I have is the cob-shaped loaves with the crisscross pattern, which is it's called a Manchester loaf in Manchester, but I don't think it is called that. But when I used to go into the bakery back home in Pudsey in West Yorkshire, there'd be all the loaves, stacked up behind on the shelves, and the ones that always looked most delicious were the ones with the crisscross patterns. And that image has stayed with me. And
how old were you when you saw that?
I must have been 5, 6, 7, going shopping with my mum around, just doing the weekly shopping, I suppose. So very young indeed. I'm not sure whether we even bought one.
That's what I find so amazing is when I ask people, it's so often tied to an image they had as a child or an experience they had growing up. And it's, it's really emotive. And I think that's, again, one of the things for me is I struggle with just teaching older people how to make good bread. I think if you want to make any real significant change, we have to teach small children how to make bread and find a way of getting those images back into their heads. So yeah, that's really great to hear your version.
Yeah, it was nice to see very few people said, "Oh, Warburton's white sliced toasty," which I suppose must be.
Some people did.
Yeah, but quite a few, which was nice.
And also surprising as well, because I think one of the people who did say that they think of a sliced white loaf was somebody who's making some of the most amazing sourdough bread in the country. Sort of super nutritionally brilliant wholemeal bread. So it sort of haunts them, it seems.
It's very interesting. Bread psychology. Should become the first bread psychologist, David. How can people find and see your good work if they want to know more?
I'm on Instagram. I'm the Breaducator.
Good.
You can buy the book. It's Breaking Bread, How Baking Shaped Our World. And that's available from all of the places you would buy a book. And it's also an audiobook as well, and has a Kindle edition. So however you like to digest your words, it's there for you. And I also am teaching at the Pump Street workshop in Suffolk. I teach bread making, donuts, bagels, all sorts of things, and also chocolate making as well. So chocolate making is a big part of what we do. And then I'll be popping up at various festivals over the summer. And one of the main things that I've started this year is at Camp Festival, which is a tent called the Earth's Crust Bakery, which is all about showing kids exactly how bread is made from soil to sandwich. So please come and see me, come and connect with me. And yeah, I'm just looking forward to speaking to more and more people about bread.
It's been great chatting with you, and yeah, thanks for coming on the pod.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much, David. There are links to David's Instagram and his courses at Pump Street in the show notes. Sadly, the Camp Festival event that you mentioned has already just been, but I'm very sure that David will be back there next year, so file that one away for 2026. Please do check out his book, Breaking Bread. It really is a fantastic read. There are links to that book by James C. Scott, David mentioned, and there's my recipes for a cob and a cottage loaf from the blog. And there's a link to my book, Need to Know, A History of Baking, which of course covers the history of bread, but not in as much detail as David does. But of course there's stuff about all kinds of baking in there. Now, let's talk a bit of news. There's the festival, of course. Please do check it out and click those links on the show notes. Remember, it's online. If you buy a ticket and can't actually make it live, you will be able to access the recordings at a later date. On the blog, a recipe has popped up for 17th century black puddings. Fruit Pig very kindly sent me some precious fresh blood to make these puddings, which are rather different to modern ones. Very nice though. One thing I did appreciate is just how much work goes into making the puddings themselves. My book, The Philosophy of Puddings, is out now and looks at the history of puddings of all kinds, from antiquity to the present day. If you haven't read that, please check it out. And please continue to spread the good word of the podcast. We got to number 14 in the Apple Food Podcast charts for the UK. So we're sneaking up there. Please leave a rating and a review on your favourite podcast app, or a like on the YouTube channel. Tell your friends, post on social media, post on lampposts, do whatever you can. It's much appreciated. If you want to support the podcast and blog financially, and can donate a one-off coffee or pint, or start up a monthly £3 subscription, please go to the website britishfoodhistory.com and go to the Support the Blog and Podcast tab. Subscribers get access to the secret podcast, my Easter eggs page, bonus blog posts, a monthly newsletter, and get first dibs on special events. And of course, if you've got any comments, questions or queries about this episode or any episode so far, please contact me or leave a message on social media. Has this conversation sparked off any food memories, any old favourite recipes, any top tips for making bread at home on a daily basis? I want to hear your comments, please. There will be a postbag episode at the end of the season as per usual. So email me, neil@britishfoodhistory.com, or come and find me on social media. I'm on Twitter, or X if you like, and Blue Sky @NeilButtery, or Instagram and Threads as Dr. That's Dr_Neil_Buttery. The episodes, don't forget, are on YouTube now, so you can leave a comment there. Or you can post on the British Food History Facebook discussion page at facebook.com/groups/British Food History, or on the Spotify app. I check all of them and mine the comments for future editions. It's time to go. The mixing and sound engineering was done by Thomas Ntinas of the excellent Delicious Legacy podcast. Please do check it out if you haven't. He's got a very good new episode about the history of breakfast with the fantastic Pen Vogler. But off I pop. Until next time, cheerio.